right. My name is Justin, and I'm an addict. And thanks to my God, the steps, and the fellowship of other addicts, I am sober one day at a time since June 19th, 2015. And for that, I am eternally grateful. Welcome once again to the RECO12 speaker meeting. We are an organization whose addictions include alcohol, drugs, lust and sex, food and gambling, codependency, stealing, just to name a few. We come together from all places, faiths, and backgrounds to learn the similarities of addiction and to gain tools and hope from others who are walking a similar path. We invite recovering addicts with at least 1 year sobriety and who are actively working their recovery in their respective fellowships to share their experience, strength, and hope on a live Zoom meeting each Friday at noon Central Time for 20 to 25 minutes. Now, today's meeting is a bit different as I've invited a subject expert to speak to us, and I'll get to that story in a minute here to explain more about this. Then, after that 20 to 25 minute speech, we, the live audience, get the opportunity to ask questions of the speaker for another 20 to 25 minutes. In order to ask questions, please type them in the Q&A link at the bottom of your Zoom window. If you are hearing this podcast recorded and would like to participate as a live audience member in the future, or even if you'd like to be a guest speaker in a future meeting, please go to www.RECO12, that's RECO number 12.com, to learn more and submit your email address there to receive weekly invitations or to submit to become a guest speaker. RECO12 is an ad-free service, and we appreciate your help in keeping it that way. We gratefully accept contributions to help cover the cost of the Zoom platform, podcast platform, web hosting, and administrative costs. To contribute, you can go to RECO12.com/support, or you can click in the link to PayPal in the chat of the live meeting. Or if you use Venmo, you can also contribute there. Our handle is @RECO-12, spelled out TWELVE. When you contribute, please specify the meeting number. This is meeting number 14. Last week's meeting with Sarah B., a self-described blackout codependent, was amazing. So many great insights. If you missed hearing that one or any other meeting we've done so far, you can listen to them in podcast form by searching for the RECO12 Speaker Meeting podcast on virtually any podcast platform that you use, including the newly launched Amazon Music platform. Or you can go to the RECO12 website and find it under the link podcast. Now, let's introduce our guest speaker for today, Dr. Benjamin Hardy. Ben is what he's asked me to call him. I was introduced to Ben through a podcast that he was a guest on called the Richie Norton Podcast. I was in the process of developing the idea for this speaker meeting podcast, the RECO12 Speaker Meeting Podcast, and his interview with Richie Norton spoke the language of addiction and the powerlessness of willpower so clearly that I had to reach out to him right away and ask if he would be a guest speaker, and I'm so grateful that he has agreed to do this. Here's his bio. Dr. Benjamin Hardy is an organizational psychologist and best-selling author of Willpower Doesn't Work, which, by the way, is the topic of this speech. Willpower Doesn't Work, and Personality Isn't Permanent, which is really cool. Awesome. Also, his blogs have been read by over 100 million people and are featured on Forbes, Fortune, CNBC, Cheddar, Big Think, and many others. He is a regular contributor to Inc. and to Psychology Today, and from 2015 to 2018, he was the #1 writer in the world on Medium.com. He and his wife, Lauren, adopted 3 children through the foster system in February 2018, and 1 month later, Lauren became pregnant with twins, who were born in December of 2018. Hands full right there. Go ahead and take it away, Ben. The floor is now yours for the next 20 to 25.
Sounds awesome. Grateful to be with you all. Grateful to be with you. The podcast episode you listened to with Richie, I've done multiple with him. Chances are you heard one from several years ago because this book, Willpower Doesn't Work, actually came out back in 2018. I did come out with this book more recently, Personality Isn't Permanent, so I'm going to be integrating ideas from both. I hope that that's okay because my perspectives are different from what they were 2 years ago because I'm not the same person I was 2 years ago. Just like none of the people who are listening are the same people they were 2 years ago or even before COVID-19, right? So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen if that's okay. I'm going to need access to do that if possible. And again, really grateful to be with your audience, grateful to be with your people. Addiction is something very important to me, I guess just from the get-go, and I think I got access now. It's perfect. From the get-go, I'll just quickly explain. When I was 11 years old, my parents got divorced, and the divorce led to an extreme addiction on the part of my father. And he ended up becoming a very extreme addict. He was doing everything. His house became a very interesting environment. There was literally drugs and drug addicts all over the place. And I was the oldest of three boys. And so, literally there was meth, cocaine, like it was just all over the place, bongs, like, and just the strangest people began filling my house. And it was such a flip because we actually came from quite a religious background, to be fully honest with you. And so like my home seemed so normal and so stable. And then then the divorce happened. And over a few years, it just became wild to the point where we could no longer really be there. Luckily, fast forward to when I'm 20 years old, I somehow graduate from high school, although I didn't really do anything for the year after high school because I was playing video games all day, mostly World of Warcraft. But I was very depressed and ultimately ended up going on a church mission. And right before I left on that, I rekindled my relationship with my dad, and he was just coming out of his pretty vicious cycle, which he had been in for 8 or 9 years, very deep into it. And he was coming out of that. And ultimately through the few-year experience where I was doing more of a church humanitarian mission, he overcame his addictions. And so he's no longer in that place. He's actually in a great place right now. And he's been sober, 12, 13 years at this point, which is really amazing. I do have a younger brother, Trevor, who was, I would say, more emotionally traumatized by everything going on. And so he's still been struggling in addiction for, ever since he was like 12 years old. He's actually in Florida right now going through 6-month recovery. He's 5 months in, and there's a lot of good things we're learning about this. And so I find myself in an interesting place. And then I ended up studying psychology for years, better trying to understand addiction and just behavior change in general and identity change. And then we ended up getting foster kids. And so I learn about these things from so many different angles. I guess we can call me an expert, but I consider myself such a novice at this stuff. I mean, it's such a dense topic, but I'm going to cover just a few topics that I feel are valuable that I'm continuing to learn more and more about. And I'll try not to, overwhelm with too much information, but I feel like this is some of the stuff that's been really powerful for me as of late. And I'm going to do it mostly through pictures. These are pictures I've had made. So they're just going to be mostly quotes, and I'll just share with you concepts along the way. So this idea right here, the bigger the future, the better the present. Obviously with addiction, the future becomes quite muddled and you often become defined by the past. But in psychology, there's been a huge shift in emphasis as of recently. For well over 100 years, the view of psychology as a discipline was that if you wanted to understand a person, all you had to do was understand the past. And although there's a lot of truth to that, where the field of positive psychology is going now is reversing that. And that if you want to understand who a person is right now and why they're acting the way they are, all you have to really understand is their view of their own future. Now, obviously, something like addiction heavily impacts a person's view of their future, as does something like trauma. And so there's things that happen, even our belief system or our culture, those things impact our view of our future. But whatever view you have of your future, that's the thing impacting who you are today. And in philosophy, there's a concept called teleology. And basically what teleology means is it's basically the idea that every human behavior is goal-oriented. In the case of addiction, the goal could be to get high or to numb yourself from the pain, but everything we do is to achieve a goal. So obviously addiction is a great way to achieve a goal, even if that goal is just to get high or to, but every behavior is to create an end. Going to the grocery store is to create an end. Going to the gas station is to create an end. Me being on this podcast is to create an end. So every behavior is outcome oriented. And so everything we do is driven by whatever outcome we're trying to create in the future. So the present is always being driven by the future. And that leads us to question, what future are we trying to create? Psychologists now are coming to believe that what consciousness actually is the ability to imagine different future scenarios and then make decisions in the present in order to create those futures. And that's what makes us different, I guess you could say, from plants and animals, is that they don't necessarily imagine infinite numbers of futures and then change the direction of their life based on a future that they choose to put energy into. But we can do that. We can imagine all sorts of different future scenarios, and then we can decide which one we want, and we can then direct our present towards something specific. And the more we can do that, and the more thoughtful we become about that, the more conscious we are, and the better decisions we can make in the present. So I'm going to tell a quick little story about a guy named Andre Norman. Andre Norman grew up in the hood of Boston, in the rough part of Boston. He was he's a black guy, a great friend of mine, amazing friend of mine. And he grew up in a tough spot, and his teachers didn't see a lot of potential in him. And so they didn't really give him any respect. He was also a troublemaker, and just probably from their perspective, just didn't have a lot of potential. But he luckily had one teacher who saw him as a human being, who spoke to him as a human being, who defended him against the other teachers, and ultimately gained Andre's trust. And Andre began to just love Miss Ellis. He would go to her class because he just felt like he could be himself there. And ultimately he fell in love with band because she was the band teacher. And so he started playing the trumpet. And for the next 2 years, he would go to Miss Ellis's class and he would actually put his energy into it. And he would not do that in his other classes. And so the trumpet became a big part of Andre's identity. It became a part of his future. It became a part of his purpose. He actually considered his trumpet his purpose. He fell in love with it. Even though he'd like get in trouble all the time and he'd go to, detention, he would play his trumpet. And so he would do that. And outside of school, it was the opposite. He would spend time with his rough friends. Well, once Andre went up into junior high school, he was now in a new school and there was no Miss Ellis. But Mr. Ellis was the teacher. And so he was still going to be in band, and that's why Miss Ellis got him into that specific school. But the problem is that Andre got these new friends at this new school. And they told him that if he wanted to be their friend, he couldn't carry around his trumpet box because it made them look dumb. And so he ultimately decided to throw away his trumpet. It was a hard decision, but when he threw his trumpet in the dumpster, he said that all of a sudden his purpose disappeared. And he no longer had a reason to go to school because now he no longer had that side of his identity. He had thrown it away. And looking back on his life, because ultimately what happened was now that the trumpet was no longer a part of his identity, his whole focus shifted towards fitting in with his friends and really going all in on that, which was criminal behavior, and ultimately landed him in prison. Looking back on the experience, because Andre did get in prison and he had a really rough life, he's now out, and I'll explain a little bit more on that in the future. But he said, looking back, and he was telling this story to my kids in our living room, he said that the reason he went to prison is because he quit the trumpet at age 14. He said, bad people don't go to prison, quitters do. He said, when I quit on my trumpet, I began quitting on everything else, including myself, which is really interesting. So when Andre made it into prison, he realized that there was a hierarchy in there, and that the worst criminals of all were the ones at the top of the totem pole. And so that became his new goal. And whatever your goal is, that's the thing shaping your identity. And your identity is the most important, crucial aspect of who you are. Your identity is how you see yourself. It's how you explain yourself. It's the story you tell about yourself. And it's the thing that drives all of your behavior. Yes, it's heavily impacted by who's around you. It's impacted by your environment. It's impacted by many things. But at the end of the day, it's how you see and explain yourself. And that's the thing that drives your behavior. And so Andre made his way up the top. One day during, he went into the gym and he began stabbing multiple people because he was angry, and that landed him 10 into solitary confinement, but it also added 10 years. So he got landed into solitary confinement and also got 10 extra years onto his prison sentence. And to him, that was a huge honor because his goal was to be the number one guy in prison. And so to him, that was evidence that he was moving closer and closer towards his goal. To you and me, that might sound crazy, but from his perspective, because he was being driven by his goals, and you are being driven by your goals, whatever they are. And so whatever future you're trying to accomplish in your mind, that's the thing driving your identity and your behavior, which is really interesting if you think about it in the terms of addiction, because in many ways, the goal becomes just to get that next high or whatever it may be, or to escape whatever you're trying to escape. And so there was a moment for Andre when he was really close to achieving his goal. He was going to kill several people in his solitary confinement unit because of a riot that had occurred. And he ultimately had a coming to Jesus moment. He called it his Wizard of Oz moment, where he was getting ready to go kill some people. And he knew if he had killed them all, he would have multiple life sentences. He would be in prison today if he had gone through with this act. But he realized at the end of it just struck him. It just struck him hard. And he got struck with the idea that maybe this is a bad idea, and maybe what I'm doing right now isn't worth it. And maybe being the number one guy in prison is actually not worth that much. And so that's basically what happened. He questioned it. He realized that at the end of the brick road, there's really nothing there. The Wizard of Oz is a hoax. And so he went back to his prison cell and he questioned his life. He questioned his goals. He questioned himself, and he had, his identity became rocked. And he decided he wanted to go to Harvard because that was the only college he'd ever heard of. And he believed that going to Harvard or going to college would keep him out of prison forever. So Harvard became his new trumpet. That became his new purpose. It became his new identity. And over the next 8 years, he worked really hard to get out of prison. And he did get out of prison. He learned how to read, learned how to write, learned law, got therapy, got mentors, avoided all of the losers in prison, and ultimately 8 years later got out of prison. It took him another 14 years once he was out of prison, but he did get a fellowship at Harvard, and he had an office there, and they funded his research to help prison inmates. And now he's doing that stuff now, and he's a very famous public speaker and author. I only tell his story because all along the way, his goal was the thing that shaped his identity. For a while, it was the trumpet. Then it was fitting in with his friends. Then it was being the number one guy at prison. Then it was Harvard. Now it's other things. And so I point that to you and I say, whatever it is that you're trying to accomplish in your life, that's the thing shaping your identity. And your identity is the thing that shapes your behavior. So really, and just to keep this brief, there's a lot of research now on the subject of future self. Your future self is very different from your current self. Just like who you are today is different than who you were in the past. You're not the same person you were 5 years ago. You see the world differently. You maybe have different habits, beliefs, different priorities, different perspectives. You have a different environment. You've got maybe different friends. And it's important to realize that you would do things differently now than your former self did. You wouldn't do everything the same way you did. And so you're not the same person, but you should never be angry at your former self. The only thing that you need to have towards your former self is empathy and compassion, because they were dealing with different problems than you're dealing with now. They didn't have the knowledge or the perspectives that you have now. And so it's okay. It's good to recognize that you're not the same person you used to be, but it's also, there's no value in being angry or upset at your former self. Andre is certainly not angry at who he was. He actually just understands that who he was a pretty broken individual trying to figure things out, who had the wrong perspectives and the wrong goals because of where he had come from. But your future self should be viewed as a different person because they will be a different person. Think about it like this, and it's very true with addiction, but there are things right now that you say no to that your former self used to say yes to. There's things that your former self used to value or care about or focus on that you no longer have any interest in. And the same is true of your future self. Your future self has said no to things that you're still saying yes to. They've crossed a point of no return on various things that you're still, focusing on. And so the more you view your future self as a different person, the better off you'll be. What the research shows in psychology is that most people think that who they are today is who they're always going to be. Most people, and the Harvard psychologist, oh my goodness, I forget his name off the top of my head. Anyways, so there's a TED Talk called The Psychology of Your Future Self. His name is Daniel Gilbert. He said that human beings are works in progress that mistakenly think they're finished. We're works in progress that think we're finished because we think that who we are right now is for the most part who we're always going to be, and that's false. Your future self is going to be way more different than you are right now than you expect they'll be. And so the goal is that you start to imagine who your future self is. That's what Albert Einstein said. Imagination is more important than knowledge. But most people, they spend most of their time remembering the past and not taking the time to imagine or decide upon their future. And that's really what consciousness is the ability to imagine and then decide upon a future. So I want to just make this super simple, and I want to kind of peel over towards more of the the willpower doesn't work side of things. But I just want to make this hyper practical for a second. When it comes to motivation, there's a few things you need to understand in order to really understand how motivation works. So for Andre, he had one goal, and it was to get into Harvard. If Andre had 4 or 5 or 6 or 10 goals, he'd still be in prison. Because if you have more than one major thing you're trying to accomplish at a time, then your motivation is going to be spread too thin. Motivation is built by taking 20 steps in one direction, not one step in 20 different directions. And so what you want to do after you've imagined your future self, let's just say it's 3 to 5 years out, you've defined out who your future self is and what they're up to. You then want to decide one goal that will allow you to accomplish that future self, because you need to turn it into an outcome. And I'll give myself as an example. Like when I was an undergrad in psychology, my one major goal was to get into a PhD program. That was the one outcome that was driving everything I did. Once you have a clear goal, you can create a process to getting it. But if you have too many goals, then the process gets muddled. And if you have too many goals, then you have an unclear identity. When I was in graduate school, I really wanted to become a professional author. And so my one goal became to get a 6-figure book deal. Once I had that clear goal, I could create a process. If I'd had like 5 goals, I don't know what I'd be doing right now. And so you need to have a single measurable outcome that if you achieve it, it allows you to do everything else you want to accomplish. Whatever the goal is that you have, that's the thing that determines your process. And in order to have motivation, you really need 3 things. You first off need a goal, but then you need, and whatever that goal is, it just needs to be something valued to you, but that's also a clear outcome that you can actually drive your behavior towards. You do need a process, an A to B to get there. You need a path to get there. You can't have hope without a path. And then you need to develop the confidence. And the confidence just comes by getting small wins, by getting support, by getting help from other people. By just taking small steps, you start to see that you can actually walk this path, and that builds up your motivation. And that actually takes me to hope. Hope obviously is something really important for addiction. This is a great quote. There's a lot of research on hope, but without hope, there can be no agency, which is the thing that allows you to take goal-directed action. Hope is the basis for agency. It's the basis for your ability to make choices. If you don't have hope, you can't actually make choices. You can't be motivated and you won't take action. And there's a lot of research on grit. And basically what the research shows is that without hope, you can't even have grit. You couldn't have grit. So this is what Angela Duckworth said. She said, grit depends on a different kind of hope. It rests on the expectation that our own efforts can improve our future. I have a feeling tomorrow will be better is very different from my resolve to make tomorrow better. So this is really how hope works. And I just want to make sure I haven't actually gone over. No, still good for a minute? Okay. So hope works like this. First, you have a vision of whatever future you want, your future self. You out of addiction, you in an amazing career, whatever it is, you need a specific vision. Then you need that sense of agency, which is the ability to make choices. If you don't believe you actually can do anything to create that future, you can't have hope. And then you need a strategy. I think that's what 12-step programs are for and things like that, is they give you strategies. That's what education's for. That's what groups are for. That's what networks are for. That's what education is for. So it's to give you a path or a strategy to actually creating that future. If you don't have these 3 things, you can't have hope. And if you don't have hope, you actually won't have motivation and you won't make choices. There's been a lot of research on the difference between high hope people versus low hope people. High hope people have clear goals. Low hope people don't have any. High hope people believe they've got the ability to make choices. They're constantly learning and trying new things. And here's what's really specific about high hope people. When they fail, they take that understanding and adjust their plans. They adjust their strategy. They adjust their process. They don't just keep doing the same thing over and over and over again and expecting a different result. Whereas low hope people, if they're not getting the result they're looking for, they don't learn from that. They don't learn that it's not working. And if you're pursuing any form of future, you have to be fully honest about the results you're currently getting. I'll just give myself as an example. And this is a non-addiction example, but I'm really trying to be successful with this new book that I came out with. But the truth is, and it's done pretty good, but it's nowhere near where I'm trying to get it. And so I've had to look in the mirror and say, okay, I've been working really hard, but what I've been doing hasn't really gotten me to the level I want to go. And so I can either keep doing what I'm doing, or I can learn how to do something better. And so that's about adjusting your plans. And that's what people with high hope do, is they actually find a better path to getting what they want rather than just assuming that what they're doing is going to get them there. There's a really, really powerful quote that I want to share with you guys. And this comes from Robert Brault. Robert Brault said, "We're kept from our goal, not by obstacles, but by a clear path to lesser goals." So in psychology, the idea of decision, what decision means is that you've cut off alternative options. You've removed the other options. You've completely eliminated them. And so just to repeat Robert Brault one more time, we're kept from our goal, not by obstacles. It's not obstacles that stop us. It's actually clear paths to lesser goals. It's that we can see clear paths to lesser futures. And so we just take those. And so the real idea of a decision is to eliminate other options. And so this is going to kind of be my last little sequence, and then we can open up to Q&A. This is kind of where the willpower stuff really comes in. And in my opinion, it's what's taught me a lot about addiction lately. So this is a quote from the Harvard business professor, Clayton Christensen. He said 100% is easier than 98%. Because if you're only 98% committed to something, what that actually means is that you haven't yet made the decision. And instead, you're dealing with what's called decision fatigue. Decision fatigue means there's something on your back burner, which is obviously a big aspect of addiction, but you haven't yet removed the alternative option. You haven't eliminated it as a decision. You haven't gone 100% yet. You're still weighing the option. And if you haven't yet made a decision, then you're going to burn out your willpower. I'll give an example. So I have a friend named Nate, and he's someone who struggled with his weight his whole life. He comes from a background where his parents have struggled with their weight, very overweight. He's now in his early 40s. His parents are in their 70s. His father just died, but they've been really unhealthy for over a decade. And it's saddened Nate to see his parents in that state, but it's also made him look at his own future. Again, whatever view you have of your future, that's the thing driving your present. Not only your biology, but not only your psychology, but your biology. And so Nate and I were talking, and basically we came to the conclusion that what we were asking ourselves, what's the one thing, Nate, that you could do that would forever change how you feel about your weight or just about your future? And he ultimately decided that he would go off sugar, 100% off refined sugar. And initially his goal was to go off for a year off sugar. But I was thinking, like, Nate, once that year's over, what's going to happen? Are you just going to go back and have a healthy relationship with this? This is something that's been impacting you for decades. And so he decided to go off sugar, refined sugar, that is, for the rest of his life. And here's what's really cool about what happened. Once he actually imagined the idea of going off refined sugar for the rest of his life, his view of his future self changed. Rather than dying overweight and basically increpid in his 70s, he saw himself in his 90s, fully healthy, thriving, and being able to do what he loves to do, which is travel, adventure, hike, being with his, he imagined himself being with his grandkids. And so that's what he realized he needed to do, is he needed to go 100%, and it needed to be for the rest of his life. And that's something that I've recently come to the conclusion of. I've actually had an addiction to caffeine for quite a while. And my view of my future self with caffeine is very different from my future self without it. And a couple of weeks ago, I was going down to visit my brother Trevor, and it's like a 4-hour drive down to where he was at. And I was tired, and I've been off caffeine for quite a while now, but I was on a long drive, and I was thinking to myself, I was really kind of feeling foggy, and I was like, I should probably just grab an energy drink. Like, this is a long drive. This seems like a totally normal scenario in which to drink caffeine. Like in the past, I would use caffeine to basically do anything and everything. I don't do that anymore, but this seems like a situation where I could probably justify it. This is normal. But then I thought to myself, if a heroin addict was off heroin like 98%, but they were trying to look for a normal situation in which heroin would make sense, I would never have that conversation in my head, because heroin is something that is forbidden to me. And so that actually takes me to a principle, and this will kind of be my last concept. This is a concept in physics, actually. It's called the totalitarian principle. It's in quantum mechanics. And basically what it means is that everything that is not forbidden is compulsory. If it's not, and this is true in literal physical systems. So like if it's not forbidden, there is some probable aptitude that it will happen. So in the universe, if something isn't forbidden, at some point or another, it will happen. And so you need to ultimately make it forbidden. And that's what I actually ended up doing. I didn't end up stopping eating caffeine. I actually came up with some different coping mechanism, which was maybe to turn on music, roll down the window, and then just realize I don't need this because it's forbidden to me. It's not even an option. And then I made it down to visit my brother. I made it back, and I had extreme energy, but I also had confidence. And confidence comes by actually watching yourself succeed. They call it identity capital. And once you do that, your view of your future self expands. This is actually a quote from Michael Jordan. Once I made a decision, I never thought about it again. And I think that that's when you really know that you've overcome the addiction, is when you've made it forbidden, you've gone public about it, you've asked for help, you've gotten the support you need, you've removed the thing from your environment, you've been very explicit about your future self. You tell people about your future self. that I am no longer someone who is dealing with this. I do have my support group. And you just tell people who your future self is, because when you tell people who you really want to be versus continually telling them who you've been, then your behavior starts being driven by your future. And then other people start expecting the future you versus the former you. And so that's kind of the key. And so anything that's not forbidden is compulsory. I think that that's a crucial concept. And I think that has a lot to do with your environment. It has a lot to do with who's around you. It has a lot to do with the story in your head. If you're 98% committed to this thing, then it will come back. And it's going to hit you like a ton of bricks. What it means is that you're still weighing those lesser goals. And so true decision means you've removed that. And so I guess I'll stop there.
Awesome. Thank you, Ben. I really appreciate that. There were a lot of things for thought, some great thoughts and that you brought across there. Before we get to the Q&A section, Ben, I'd like to give you a minute here to talk about some projects you're working on right now, how people can learn about you and access the materials we've talked about here. Go ahead and do that, and then we'll jump into the Q&A section.
Sure. Yeah, so obviously willpower doesn't work, which I didn't fully go all the way into. I've learned a lot of new things about willpower that go beyond just environment. So I shared some of them today, but Willpower Doesn't Work is a great book. But this one's the one I'm really excited about. Personality Isn't Permanent. I actually think it would solve more problems even than Willpower Doesn't Work as it relates to addiction. And I created a full 30-day future self program, entirely free. Every day you'd get a new email and a new probably 15-minute training with lots of science. And it's just on my website, benjaminhardy.com. If you want, you can just put your email in, get access to the 30-day future self program. I think it's extremely valuable. A lot of content, hours of content, journal prompts and things like that, which is totally free.
Awesome. Thank you for that. And I put your link in the chat here. And then when I do release the podcast later this evening or tomorrow, I'll put that link in the show notes of the podcast. So Ben, now what we'll do is we'll start the Q&A section. It's now time for Dr. Hardy, Ben, to answer your questions. I've got several questions here. If you, the listening audience, have any, please type them in the Q&A section of the Q&A link at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And we'll get to that. So Ben, a couple of the things that you said really jumped out at me, and I love that last thing. Everything that isn't forbidden is compulsory. One of the big things that I have found in addiction, and it also goes along with something else that you mentioned earlier that I related to something that we find in the big book and in other recovery things, is I really, as an addict, wish that I could be like others and drink like a gentleman, or lust like a gentleman, or drink caffeine like a gentleman, like what you were talking about.
I can't do it. I can't drink caffeine like a gentleman.
Yeah, we just go out of control there. So dive into that a little bit more. How does that concept of everything that is not forbidden is compulsory? I'll eventually go back. If I say I want to be able to drink like a gentleman, then I'm just going to end up drinking not like a gentleman. Talk a little bit more about that, please.
I would say the problem is your relationship to that thing. For one reason or another, whether it's drinking, for me it was caffeine, for Nate it was sugar. Nate is not an alcoholic. He's someone who's grown up in a very conservative religious environment. The dude barely drinks soda. But for some reason, he's based on his family situation and dynamic and just like where he's been, he's got this weird relationship with sugar. And so we all have probably something that we've developed an unhealthy relationship with. For me, it was caffeine for a long time. And it just became that thing that I used to cope or to get myself through stress. For you, it could be alcohol or marijuana or whatever it is. I don't know. But it's really your relationship with that thing that's the problem. And that if you want to keep going back to it, it's going to basically pull back your former self. It's going to pull you back. It's going to rewind you. And then your view of your future is going to get really limited as a result. And so it's not necessarily the substance itself. Again, for me, I don't have as negative of a relationship with sugar as an example to my friend Nate. But it's just he's got so much baggage with that thing. And that's the tool that he uses to cope with, that when he goes into his vicious cycles of sugar, all of a sudden his view of his future dramatically changes. And so I really think the impact is that whatever this thing is that you have, your Achilles heel, whatever that may be, when you're trying to fit that really contradictory thing, it contradicts your future self. It contradicts the future you want. So when you try to fit that contradiction in, your view of your future self dramatically plummets, which then leads you to not a really good present. It leads you to, so what I think it is personally is just what it does to your view of your future.
Thank you very much. I got a question that came in from Johnner. Johnner says, I desperately want to have a big life goal to help provide the motivation and interest in moving forward in life, but I don't know exactly what I want. How can I go about finding my purpose in life? And then he added in for example, I know I want to feel successful and full of hope, but I'm not sure how to achieve this or what goal to go after. So what thoughts do you have for him?
I think that's beautiful. One thing that is true is it's impossible to have hope without a goal. I mean, even if the goal is, on a more spiritual plane, just to be with God, but you need some future. And I think that really what confidence and hope are about is the understanding that you actually get to choose your future. It's not something you actually find. It's actually coming to the point where you choose what you value. So for me, for example, like the view that you conjure up for your future self and the things you ultimately commit to are based on what you value. So for me, I have 5 kids. I'm not saying everyone else should have 5 kids, but I value family. That's like a legit value I have. And so the only way to actually choose goals is to determine what's valuable and what's worth pursuing. I chose to be a writer, not because I found my passion, but because I believed it was something valuable and useful to develop, because I had such impacting experiences reading books. When I was serving that church mission, I read a lot of books that changed my life. And so I began to see value in that. And so then I made it my goal. And so I guess to answer the question, you have to actually think about what's valuable, what's useful over something else. There's a million options out there, but what do you value right now that you think would be worth investing your time and energy in? And ultimately you then use that to determine your future self, and you use your future self, whoever you want to be, in a more practical sense, like where you want to be in like 3 or 4 years. What does that actually look like? I think that imagination is actually a skill. And I think as people grow older, they stop imagining their future self as much. And so, I think that that's a lot where journaling comes from. Obviously, journaling is an amazing tool for addiction, but it's also an amazing tool for imagination and thinking about the future situations you want to be in. And then ultimately, let's just say you're making great money, you're in an amazing relationship, or whatever it is you see, whatever it is you value and really want a couple of years from now. Then you think, okay, and you can't accomplish it all in 5 years. Like, let's just say you nail out a few big things, maybe being in a really healthy relationship and just having a great job is like your future in the next 3 or 4 years that you see. What's the number one thing that if it came true, what's the most important outcome that needs to happen in that case? Is it finding that person who's amazing and developing an amazing relationship? Is that the first thing that you need to do? And maybe that'll take 3 or 4 years to do. It's just ultimately deciding what you value, visualizing your future self, and then choosing the most important outcome you can focus your energy and attention on right now. And then ultimately, obviously, getting the support that you need to do it, because you shouldn't try to do it alone. And I think addicts often have a way of trying to do things without help. And so you have to just own it from an addiction standpoint. And that's really an insight that you learn in general about goal achievement, is that to achieve goals is the same way as to overcome an addiction. You need help. You need to tell people that you need help. You need accountability. You need support. You need a new environment. You need a group. Moving your life forward and overcoming an addiction follow the same principles.
I love that. Yeah, the addict response oftentimes, almost every time.
I can do this myself, right?
Yeah, I got myself into this mess. I have to get myself out of this mess. What a mess,
you can't
right?
get yourself out.
Yeah.
And you can't get yourself to whatever that goal is in your future self on your own. Yes, you can be the one putting in the work. Yes, you can be the one creating the direction, but ultimately you need help, whether that, even if that's through mentorship or through a community or through reading books, through getting education. But every time I have a new goal, I know I need huge support in getting there. That's why you need to be really explicit about who your future self is. Rather than just telling the story of your former self, you need to tell people, this is what I want. I want to be in an amazing relationship, or I'm really trying to get out of this addiction that I have a hard time with. It's just about owning the facts and saying, this is where I really want to go. Then you can start to get the right support you need to get there. Awesome. And there's nothing weak in that. It's actually how you move your life forward. It's what you would do if you became committed to your future.
Right. I love that. All right. So we got a question that came in from Zach. Zach says, hey, Ben, step 1 of the 12 steps is I acknowledge that I am completely powerless over my acting out and my life has become unmanageable. Step 1 means I stop fighting my addiction and become 100% willing to do whatever I need to do to stay clean. I introduce myself at meetings as a recovering addict, but I have worried that introducing myself with the addict label could lead to a fixed mindset, quote, once an addict, always an addict. What would you recommend for me to have a growth mindset while in recovery?
So first off, I want to acknowledge AA is the system that has helped millions and millions of addicts, and I am just one person. But going off of my knowledge, that's probably the one area of AA that I do disagree with. I do agree with the fact that you want to hedge against all possible potentials of failing. And so but I do agree that overemphasizing your current or your former self is what Carol Dweck would call a fixed mindset, fundamentally. Having a growth mindset means you're defined by the future person you want to be, and you don't put as much stock into who you are. I think in telling people about your future self, so that you're someone who has beat that, you could still say, but I also know that I've in the past been crushed, like I'm not the same person I was in the past. But yeah, I think emphasizing who you want to be is more important than even emphasizing who you are. And so that's more the approach I go with, is focusing on my future self. That's what Carol Dweck would call a growth mindset. And so I'm pretty anti-labels. Like there's a lot of research on labeling yourself and about what that does for you. Your label ultimately becomes your identity. And so if you label yourself as an addict, then then the idea is that who you are today is who you're always going to be. And you can't see yourself being without that label. So, and there's been a lot of research on this. People who label themselves as depressed think that they're always going to be depressed. People who label themselves as an introvert think that they always have to be an introvert. And that very much limits their capacity, first off, for imagining themselves as a different person without that. And I strongly emphasize your future self is different than who you are today. I'm fundamentally different from who I was even 4 or 5 years ago. I have very different values, very different goals, At a very high level, yes, I still believe in God. Did I believe in God 10 years ago? Yes. But as far as like legit values as reflected in my behavior, I now spend so much of my energy like trying to dedicate to my kids, trying to dedicate to like my work and stuff like that. Whereas in the past, like I had other values as reflected in my behavior. Your future self is going to be the same thing. Your future self is going to value different things. They're going to focus on different things. They're going to care about different things. They're going to have said no, like I said, to things you're currently saying yes to. So I do think it's more powerful to focus on your future self and to, just to not be so tied to your labels. But I think it's still important to recognize that that's something you've been in the past. I did have addictions in the past. That was my former self. That's not my current nor my future self, but that is a part of my story. And I don't ever want to go back there again. So here's why this is my future self. I know that may be slightly contradictory to the whole once an alcoholic, always an alcoholic. But that's just based on my understanding.
Yeah. So let me follow up on that just real quick. Now you talked about video games. I think it was World of Warcraft or something like that. And then caffeine.
I was playing 15 hours a day.
Yeah. So that's heavy duty stuff right there. But that's not who you are today.
I have zero connection to that person.
Yeah. What would happen if, for whatever reason, there was 98% conviction here, and you went back and got into World of Warcraft today? What would happen with that situation?
If I did that now?
Yeah, which obviously you aren't going to choose that, but if you had that 98% instead of the 100%.
Yeah. I mean, if I was 98, first off, I wouldn't even be in my situation. I couldn't have created this situation if I was 98% committed. I wouldn't be married with 5 kids and literally a 6th on the way. I probably wouldn't have even gone for the PhD. But let's just say for some reason, something triggers me, life gets crazy, and I start playing World of Warcraft again. And I think I'm going to do it in a healthy way, right? But all of a sudden I start sneaking it while I'm at work or something like that, and it turns into something. It may not destroy my marriage, but it would probably, mess a lot of things up. I have created such an aversion to that it is contradictory to the current identity I have. And it's very contradictory to the future I'm creating. And so it would be very difficult to see me justifying doing that, just because I know the repercussions. I know the repercussions far too much now to let that happen. But yeah, if I was 98, to your point, it would begin overruling my life.
No, I appreciate that. And that's kind of where I stand with addiction. I believe that the last time I acted out in my addiction can be the last time I act out. But I also know that if I make that choice at some point in the future, I will be in big trouble.
My thoughts about that, and this may be something, again, you disagree with, but I actually think everyone is an addict. maybe it's never been manifested, but I actually think all behavior is addictive. I mean, if you think about even smartphone addiction, most people use their smartphone 5+ hours a day now. In a former environment and in a former culture, that would have been viewed very, very weirdly, if like a single individual was doing that. But we're now in a culture where that's acceptable behavior, and so most behavior is addictive. If you start waking up early and like going to the gym and like feeling motivated, you're going to want to do it more. If you start really getting into reading or getting into 12-step groups, you're going to start wanting to do it more. Like most behavior creates the desire to do more of it, especially if you feel good about it. That goes back to actually the question, which was feeling successful. There's a lot of research on this, that anything that does make you feel good or feel successful, you'll want to do more of, which is actually why addictions and habits can be formed in a single event. Is because in a single, it's not always repetition that's required to create an addiction or a habit. It's just that extreme feeling of I feel great or I feel good doing this thing. And so if you can create, that's why actually social media is so addictive. There's likes and things like that for a reason. They make you feel special. They make you feel good. It's engineered so that you feel good, so that you keep wanting more of it. And so all behavior that makes you feel good or successful is by nature addictive.
I actually am on board with what you just said there. One thing you mentioned pretty early on in this presentation was the concept of letting go of anger at my former self.
This is huge.
Yeah, and I work with a lot of addicts. I sponsor a lot of people, and this is the hardest thing. And it was really hard for me too, to forgive myself for past transgressions, for past behaviors that brought me a lot of anger towards myself. What are some tricks of the trade, some things that you think work to help me not be angry at myself and forgive myself?
Yeah, if I share my screen one more time?
Absolutely.
All right, I'm going to show you this right here. I think that this is an extremely valuable tool. Usually, if you're still mad at your former self, it's because you believed something happened to you, whatever that was. My father becoming a drug addict. Why did that happen to me? If you believe something happened to you, then you're going to be bitter. If you believe that something happened for you, you can become better. So that's the key, is either you're going to be bitter or better. If you frame any scenario as this happened for me, then you can start to own it and you can start to look at what you can do because of it. So if I legitimately believe that my father becoming a drug addict when I was 11 happened for me, and if I start looking at it from that lens, then I can start to actually find ways in which that experience benefited me and helped me and that I can use it. It's also really important to realize something about memory. So memory is never actually objective. It's always just a perspective. So the view I had of my experience of my dad being a drug addict when I was 11 should be very different from the view I have of that experience as a 32-year-old person. Like a 32-year-old should have a different perspective of an event than an 11-year-old. But the problem with often trauma or just being angry at something you did in the past or something that occurred to you is that you're still viewing it from the experience of when it happened. You're still viewing it from the lens of when you initially had the experience. And obviously the experience wasn't pleasant. There was either a failure involved or just hurt involved. And so because of the emotions you felt back then, you created meaning, whatever that meaning was. And that's what created the lens that you have towards that experience. And that meaning actually shapes your identity and shapes your future. And so I think the beautiful part about memory is that memory is very flexible. Memory is always reconstructed in the present. And so you can change the meaning of any past situation to, rather than it being something that happened to you or something you're mad about, it can be something you're grateful for. I think one really important, crucial aspect of that is realizing that you're not the same person you were in the past. Yes, your former self made some choices, but those aren't the decisions you would make today. If you right now, the current version of you was placed back in those former situations, you would handle those situations very differently. And your former self had constraints and they had limitations that you now don't have, even if it's just in the form of perspective or knowledge or understanding. And so, number one, you don't need to create the same meaning that your former self made. You actually can and should create meanings that are more beneficial, more positive, more grateful oriented. But also, as it relates to both your former self as well as other people's former selves, the only thing you need is compassion and empathy. So as it relates to my dad as one example, I first off know that who my dad is today is not who he was 20 years ago. He's a totally different person. Yes, he kind of looks the same, but if he didn't look the same and we just compared the two people's behaviors, you would never assume that they were once the same person. Like they are fundamentally different people. And so rather than being angry at my dad's former self 20 years ago, rather than the current me being mad at someone from 20 years ago, the best thing I could do is just try to better understand where he was coming from. And I do that by asking questions. When you get more context is what creates meaning. Context is what shapes the meaning of content. And so by getting more context, you immediately become more compassionate and more understanding. If you don't understand something, then you have more judgment towards it. But once you understand the full picture, you're pretty understanding. And so for me, one example of what I did was I asked my dad, what the heck happened? What led you to doing all of those drugs and for all of that crazy stuff? And when he gave me his perspective and told me a lot of things that I didn't know, maybe even things from like his backstory and like when he was adopted, when he was bullied as a kid and like stuff involved with my parents' marriage, that I had no clue of as an 11-year-old. Once I got all that context, not that I justify my dad's decisions, but holy cow, I've got a lot more compassion towards why he did. But ultimately, I think that this is the key. Even when you make mistakes, it doesn't even have to be related to an addiction. When you make a mistake, which I make mistakes every day, if I can just say this is happening for me, then I can start to take full responsibility. I can start to take the action I need to protect myself from it happening again. And I can just own it so that I can move forward. If I still view it as it's happening to me, then I'm still defined by the past and I'm stuck there.
Awesome. Thank you for that. I really like that. If things happen for me, if I view them as why did that happen for me rather than happen to me, that shifts everything, and it can when I believe it. One of the really repeating word that you've used in this is a decision, and make a decision. And I think that's where our agency lies. No matter where I am in my life, I can always I have a choice. The choices I may have put myself in a corner to where my choices are extremely limited, but I always have a choice. And step 3 reads, made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood him. And that is a huge thing there. And that's kind of what I want to not close this out with, but want to go back to is that this decision is always mine to make. There may only be a millisecond to make that decision in some instances, but I can still make that decision. So before we close up, Ben, do you have any closing words of wisdom or invitations for us?
I think that there's a few thoughts that I have, and they're very powerful. One is take the time to appreciate the differences between your current and your former self. And when I say appreciate, what I mean is literally pull out your journal and actually like decide a timeline. Could be last year, it could be 5 years ago, 10 years ago, but literally write out in what ways the current you are different from who you used to be in situation, in mindset, it's really powerful to take the time to see how your life is different and how you're different from your former self. And that gives powerful hope. You get hope and motivation by actually seeing progress in many ways. And it's really cool just to actually even just honestly recognize the wins. Even like every 90 days, I take the time to reflect on what are the big things that happened in the last 90 days that I'm excited about or that were powerful and that I'm glad happened. Could be personal, could be professional. So I think just taking the time to measure progress and consistently see where you're at versus where you used to be is powerful. I think just second off, just dovetailing off everything I've said. In order to actually make decisions, you actually have to think about where those decisions are going to go. And so the more you can actually begin to think about your future self and begin making decisions in the present that are going to be useful to your future. And this has, it's the same principle as even investing money. Beginning to invest money right now, even if it's that whole quote that the best time to start planting a tree was 20 years ago, but the second best time is today, just do something today. Like, even if it's a small thing. And if you do it today, it's gonna be easier tomorrow, as it relates to investing money, like if you start doing it eventually you're going to experience that compound effect. And I think that's a true principle in general. And so I invite people to think about where they want to be in their future and start planting small seeds, because whatever small seeds you plant today in 20 years are going to be huge oak trees. And so start planting small trees, or start thinking about what you want that tree to look like, or what you want your life to look like in the future, and then just start planting the seeds today. Like, if you start doing that and you do that every day, you can have a pretty big life. You can have an amazing life, and that is what gives you hope.
Awesome. Thank you, Ben. All right. Thanks again. That was a great RECO12 weekly speaker meeting for all addicts and those who wanting to learn more about addiction and the recovery therefrom. If we didn't get to your question, or if you have additional questions, please go to RECO12.com/forum and join in our community and ask those questions and answer others' questions that will come up. I invite the audience to come back next week. If you've not yet gone to RECO12.com and submitted your email address, you only need to do it once. Please get on the invitation list so you can join us live each Friday at noon Central Time. Next week, our speaker will be Blake, who is a sexaholic, and we're excited about that one. It should be entertaining. He's pretty lively. Now, if you'd like to join me in the step 3 prayer to launch us off for the rest of the day, please do so now. God, I offer myself to thee, to build with me and to do with me as thou wilt. Relieve me of the bondage of self, that I may better do thy will. Take away my difficulties, that victory over them may bear witness to those I would help of thy power, thy love, and thy way of life. May I do thy will always. Amen. Ben, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much. I'll follow up with you via email, and we will talk soon. Have a great day, everybody, and keep coming back. It works if you work it, so work it. You are worth it.
Reflecting on the landscape of this life of mine.